understanding of Islamophobia is that this is a form of hatred and fear that combines itself against Muslims and Islam and against Islamic presence. This is a fear that is indissolubly linked with the nation state. So when one wants to understand Islamophobia, one can only understand this through the rubric of the nation state. And therefore, it is a certain conditioning of the nation state that makes especially its native, so to say, native inhabitants, people who consider themselves to be original inhabitants. I mean, no one is an original inhabitant. Everyone by degrees of generations is a settler or a native. I'm reminded of Mahmood Mamdani's recent book, Neither Settler Nor Native. But, the larger majority population is conditioned to look at the Muslim presence as in some way being hostile, as in some way threatening the very existence of their lives and the nation state itself. So I think it is a fear and a prejudice that flows in and through the nation state, so that the nation state conditions people to look at certain people as a certain set of people, immigrants, Muslims,
friends,
as a threat to their...
I'm Abhay Kumar, and I'm right now sitting at Center for Political Study, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and with me, Professor Amir Ali is also here, and Professor Amir Ali teaches political theory at JNU, and the reason why we are here is the recent book which Professor Amir Ali had just written. It is about Brexit. This book is just out. The title is Brexit and Liberal Democracy, Populism, Sovereignty and the Nation State. It has been printed by Ruthless. And the topic which we are going to discuss today is Islamophobia, anti-Semitism and racism. And the context would be very much British, but I think this topic is very much relevant to our context as well. Those who do not know Professor Amir Ali, I just want to say a very brief, a few things. Professor Amir Ali has studied at CPS, and he earlier taught at Jamia Millia Islamia, and then in 2007 he came to JNU, and since then he has been teaching here. His general broad area of interest includes political theory, multiculturalism, group rights, but these days, for last couple of years, he has been studying and observing international politics very closely. And sir, you told me a few days back that in JNU, students are more concerned about what is happening in India. They are not much concerned about what is happening outside. So we will be talking about Islamophobia and the politics of England. He has also been Agatha Harrison Memorial Visiting Fellow at St. Anthony College, University of Oxford, and his book Islam and British Multiculturalism was published in 2016. So thank you very much for finding time and talking to us.
Thank you, Abhay.
So what we are going to do it right now, that your book Brexit and Liberal Democracy is out, and now students are very eager to read it. So what I will do here, I am going to talk about Islamophobia, which is discussed in your chapter number 6.
That's right.
And I have found this chapter very, very interesting because in our context, this topic is not much theorized and not much and debated, but we see that this is very much in news. Minorities be in India and outside, they are being attacked, they are being demonized. So we should understand the whole issue. So you have started this chapter by saying that the exit of Britain from European Union is the result of the fear of the foreigner.
That's right.
It is also the defeat of British multiculturalism, and it is also fear of people coming and settling in British society. It is also a fear that people are not getting assimilated into what should I say, the British culture or British civilization. So in this way, this is very much related to Islamophobia, because people from Asia and other ethnic origin, they are being targeted, but Muslim particularly, they are, if I'm not wrong, they are at the center of attack.
That's right.
So what you want to say more about it?
Well, first of all, Abhay, thank you for reading the book so carefully. My concern in writing this book arose from the global implications of Brexit. I mean, of course, it is a largely British phenomenon, but there are larger implications for across the world. One of these is the whole question of liberal democracy, which I think is, and one wouldn't be exaggerating if one said this, that there's a clear and present danger to liberal democracy in the way that it has been practiced. We see this kind of a slide towards a certain kind of authoritarianism in many, many societies across the world. I mean, the UK would be one example, the US certainly. India, people have been noting with great concern what has been going on, and across the world if one looks at this. So my major concern in writing this book was to look at how a phenomenon like Brexit poses a threat to the harmonious coexistence of society itself. Now, one of the attempts at such a harmonious coexistence was multiculturalism. Not that I entirely agree with everything about multiculturalism, but it was perhaps a naive attempt to bring people of different cultures together and make them coexist with some semblance of harmony and peace. Now, what happens with a phenomenon like Brexit is that earlier harmonious coexistence becomes threatened because people are then singled out on the basis of their not belonging enough to the native society, in this case Britain. So Brexit, in my opinion, is a very unwarranted fear of the foreigner, what we refer to as xenophobia. It is a fear of the immigrant. And now it so happens that at the very center of all these fears, the chapter is called the sum of all fears. At the very center of all these fears is the fear of Islam. A largely unfounded fear, a fear that is based on a great degree of ignorance and a great degree of prejudice. And therefore, this last chapter is on the whole question of Brexit and Islamophobia.
I have also read somewhere that Islamophobia is defined as fear against Muslims, fear against Islam, fear against anything which is related to Muslim or Islamic culture, and that fear is in most of the cases unfounded. So what will be your definitions about Islamophobia?
Well, it's always very difficult to kind of pin down a definition for a phenomenon, and in fact one of the things...
Your reflection on that? Yes.
Well, I mean, I'll try to come up with the definition. It's always very, very one. Famously, Socrates would always ask his interlocutors, the people who talk to in Athens, for a definition, and most of the time those people would not be very successful in offering a definition. It's not easy to kind of offer a definition, but let me try it nonetheless. But my own understanding of Islamophobia is that this is a form of hatred and fear that combines itself against Muslims and Islam and against the Islamic presence. This is a fear that is indissolubly linked with the nation state. So when one wants to understand Islamophobia, one can only understand this through the rubric of the nation state. And therefore, it is a certain conditioning of the nation state that makes especially its native, so to say, native inhabitants, people who consider themselves to be original inhabitants. I mean, no one is an original inhabitant. Everyone by degrees of generations is a settler or a native. I'm reminded of Mahmood Mamdani's recent book, Neither Settler Nor Native. But, the larger majority population is conditioned to look at the Muslim presence as in some way being hostile, as in some way threatening the very existence of their lives and the nation state itself. So I think it is a fear and a prejudice that flows in and through the nation state, so that the nation state conditions people to look at certain people as a certain set of people, immigrants, Muslims, as a threat to their societies.
But some scholars, well-known scholars at CPS who have worked on multiculturalism, they have for a long time, they have argued that the Indian case is very different, where things were accommodated. Bhikkhu Parekh and other people, they were also arguing that cultural symbols of minority and other groups, they were incorporated within the mainstream. So how far their defense of that nation state, if I say, is valid?
Well, I mean, partly it's true, but I don't think the accommodation is deep enough. It was a very superficial accommodation. The one distinction that I would want to make about India and a country like the UK, for example, is the strange thing about India, and contrasting it to the UK or Europe for that matter, is that the guarantor of minorities in this country was secularism. The point that Rajiv Bhargav, who's written very extensively on secularism makes. I mean, secularism was the guarantor of the minority presence. Now, that kind of a role in Europe and the UK is played by multiculturalism. Now, in the UK, I notice a certain kind of multiculturalism being on the back foot. Similarly, in India, secularism has been discredited. So, arising from this discrediting of these ideas, multiculturalism in the UK and secularism in India, I think that Islamophobia flows naturally to fill these kind of spaces. So, I mean, I'm someone who's very worried by the discrediting of secularism, as someone who's always thought of the future of India as being best secured by secularism. I think that, as secularism has receded, a certain Islamophobia has come to fill that space. And similarly in the UK, as multiculturalism has receded, a certain Islamophobia has come to fill that space. Now, having made this point, let me also say that both these concepts, I mean, both attempts at multiculturalism and secularism in India and multiculturalism in the UK, they at the most decided to or tried to, and I've written this in the book, they merely contained hatred against Muslims and minorities. They couldn't counter them effectively. There's a difference between containing and countering. Containing something means kind of put it in a corner so that people don't notice it. Now, at some point, it'll kind of burst into the center, or the public sphere, the mainstream, call it whatever you want to. So I think when it comes to efforts in Europe and also India for that matter, the theorists that you talked about, the attempts were not successful in countering these hatreds and prejudices enough. They merely contained it, and it was only a matter of time that containing would end, and these prejudices and hatreds would flow out and saturate the public sphere. As we see right now, I mean, in this country, we see a great level of hatred. It's very vituperative in terms of the kind of hatred that is expressed towards Muslims, and of course in Europe, the Islamophobia phenomenon that I've talked about in this book.
Okay, in your book, and particularly in this chapter, you have also mentioned British Prime Minister Johnson's role, and you have written in your chapter that his forefathers had Turkish origin, Muslim origin.
That's right.
But now he is projecting himself as more British, and in his understanding of being more patriotic, more nationalist British mean to become or to turn anti-Muslims. In our context also, our Prime Minister, who also belongs to, at least who belongs to marginalized community, but he openly goes and performs puja at Ayodhya. So both India and UK, they are democracy, and the society is basically based on secular principle. But why the top leaders are so open, so brazen in associating themselves with one particular religion? So do you see these phenomena as very worrisome?
It's very worrisome. I mean, I think in terms of the dynamics of global leaders, of course, our Prime Minister seems to be very friendly with Prime Minister Boris Johnson. In fact, the government wanted to invite Prime Minister Johnson for this year's Republic Day. I think the choice of Republic Day leaders is very indicative. I think some years previously it was Jair Bolsonaro, and of course, the friendship with Trump's America. But, coming to specifically Prime Minister Boris Johnson, I think the statements that quite often he has made are outrageous. So two of his statements immediately come to mind, and one of them is this statement about women who wear burqas, and he suggested that they look like bank robbers.
And I think letterbox. And
letterboxes. Yes. I mean, of course, this shows that Boris Johnson has a very interesting sort of imagination, but obviously there is a deep-seated sense of Islamophobia. I mean, this is hate speech. What worries me is that this hate speech and Islamophobia that someone like Johnson indulges in does not hurt his electoral prospects. Now, you contrast this with Jeremy Corbyn, the opposition Labour leader. Of course, he's no longer a Labour leader now. But the accusations of anti-Semitism that were made against him significantly hurt his electoral prospects. Now, I think that should have happened in the case of Boris Johnson as well. And I've made this point, that one needs to understand Islamophobia and anti-Semitism conjointly. So, what worries me in the point about the worrisome nature is that the fact that Johnson's deep-seated Islamophobia did not hurt his electoral prospects. In fact, in 2019, the December 2019 elections, his Conservative Party was voted to power with a 70-seat majority, which is quite a large majority. This is what really worries me, that people can indulge in hate and get away with it.
They can win the election.
Yes, win the elections and get away with it. I mean, we have seen in the 20th century how anti-Semitism and the rise of Hitler and the Holocaust against Jews, and the world said never again. I don't think the world learns its lessons sufficiently, that these forms of hatred, whichever form they take, must not be indulged in. And that politicians who indulge in these forms of hatred must be made to suffer.
I remember it that when I was doing a course under you, when you were teaching political theory, one reading which we have got is civic notion of
citizenship. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in that reading, that main focus was that in the society where citizens are very active, they are participating in democratic processes, that society will have better chance to cope up with the difficulties, and that society will prosper. But given what is happening, let's say in India or UK, in other places, that there has been the rise of authoritarian leaders. There has been the rise of authoritarian leaders, and they are gaining more and more support, and they are not winning, they are not coming to power just by doing some coup at late midnight. So if you have to look at that civic notion of citizenship, where the expectation was that the citizens will play a very active role. So is that expectation is lost?
No, it's not lost. It's just it's a matter
or where the things have gone wrong.
I mean, it's not lost. I think things can always be revived and retrieved. But I think certainly what has happened is that and I keep making this point time and time again, is that the level of public discourse has fallen so low. And this can, of course, be linked to an active citizenry. I mean, a citizenry must be vigilant about the kind of public discourse that is around. Now, to come to the Brexit issue, again, something that I've written about extensively in this book, the debate was conducted in a most misinformed manner. People didn't know what Brexit, what implications Brexit would have. Johnson himself, for example, I think he won the elections and he conducted the Brexit campaign on a series of very simplistic slogans. Get Brexit done. It's not easy as that. I mean, saying this is very easy, but this is a very simplistic slogan. So I think the problem really arises in the fact when a citizenry is not sufficiently vigilant about the kind of public discourse, the level of public discourse, which has fallen tremendously because of the social media, because of WhatsApp, and what as famously in this country it's called WhatsApp University. People rely on their information from these short messages from WhatsApp, which quite often are not true.
And media is not accountable at all.
The media certainly is not accountable. I mean, in fact, the British media, for example, I mean, a lot of the public discourse is said by the tabloid press. Rupert Murdoch's The Sun. It has a wide circulation, it was very simplistic. I think Brexit at the end of it was all about hatred. Hatred against the immigrant, hatred against Muslims, hatred against whichever group was considered to take people's jobs away. I think the tragedy of Brexit was that it was a genuine grievance. People were legitimate to think that their lives were not improving because of the European Union. But then it came out in this very perverse form. It came out in the form of hating people. By hating people, you can't improve your lives. I mean, I often, when people talk about patriotism, I have quoted the Stoic philosopher, Roman emperor Marcus Aurelius, and the point that he makes is, you can't end up hating your neighbor. A love of one's country cannot be premised upon a hatred of one's neighbor.
But it is yielding electoral dividends.
Well, I mean, look at the long-term disadvantage.
I have talked with several journalists, and they have said that this current regime, their main concern is not to do welfare work for the people, but they should appear that they are more pro-Hindu and they are against Muslims.
I mean, I think far-right political parties are adept at winning elections. The Conservative Party in the UK and, of course, the BJP here. But the point is that, yes, you win the elections, but look at the long-term damage that this is doing to the social fabric of the country for generations. For younger generations who are not being able to acquire education properly. So this, I think the worrying trend really is far-right parties being able to win elections so easily. And there's a certain knack that they've developed. They're able to win elections, but look at the long-scale damage that this is doing to countries and their social fabrics. That is the worrying part of it. I mean, the UK is a country that is torn apart completely. It is torn apart so much that there is a real possibility of of Northern Ireland wanting to go in its own way, Scotland wanting to go its own way. So there you have it. I mean, this is the long-term damage that is done to societies.
Okay, so Islamophobia is somehow linked with new racism. We know that in colonial time, the language was very different. We were told that you cannot rule yourself, you are uncivilized, you are black, you are this or you are that. But post colonization, after decolonization, the language had been changed, and if I say that the form had been changed, and you have said that new racism in the context of nation state and post-colonial world, there are new terms, new vocabulary, new idioms, that is patriotism, nationalism, xenophobia, and then Englishness. In Indian context, it would be the Indianness, Britishness, Bhartiyata, militarism, then gender difference, that here in India the people would argue that Muslims women are only suffering and something like that. So the new racism and its components, what I have just said, patriotism, nationalism, xenophobia, they are being sold, and people, if I'm correct, media is propagating them and people are also buying them. So do you see this trend also very threatening for the fabric of liberal democracy?
Yes, it is very threatening and it's very worrying again. I think the whole question of new racism needs to be looked at in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. Now, I think that's a very significant movement that arose immediately after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the effects of that were felt in the UK immediately when many statues were brought down. My sense is that the problem with new racism is that when people want to point out the problems with new racism, immediately they're accused of not sufficiently respecting their societies, not loving their countries enough. This really becomes the problem. So immediately when you point out a problem of your own society, people accuse you, oh, but you're not kind of loyal enough, you're not patriotic enough. This really is the problem with new racism. Now, in contrast to new racism, I think this inevitably will be countered by movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. This is, I think, a very promising kind of a movement, because what this brings up is the kind of lives that people lead. I mean, remember George Floyd's last words. His last words were, "I can't breathe." Now, those words have become iconic. These are words that, I think for many decades and perhaps centuries, people will remember. Now, what people must realize is that if the most vulnerable in your society are complaining that they can't breathe, the problem that they are facing, the difficulty that they are facing, will not remain confined to them. It is only a matter of time before this spreads to the rest of society. Let me give you a simple example of this. Myanmar. I mean, when the Rohingya genocide, the killings of Rohingyas was happening in Rakhine State, a vast majority of Myanmarese society was silent. Now, when the junta has cracked down on them, the rest of society is experiencing it. So I think societies need to understand that we are all integrated, that no one is so different that their concerns and their pain will not be felt by others. This is, I think, the great lesson that the Black Lives Matter movement is bringing. My own sense is that new racism, and I've talked about Paul Gilroy and his book, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, a phenomenon like new racism will be countered by the Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of upsurge for justice that this has given rise to. What I want to reiterate is that if in your society there are people who are not able to get a full 2 square meals a day, if they cannot sleep properly because of a certain fear, if they are hounded and kind of hunted down, this is a problem that won't remain confined to them. Okay, the rest of society cannot remain complacent. At some point, the problems that they face will spread to the rest of society, and society itself will be completely torn apart.
But many Dalit intellectuals in India, they are arguing that when a black was killed in USA, people came to a street, and even white, the white population also participated in. But in India, people from marginalized community, they are killed, they are attacked, and women from that community, they are being assaulted. But there is not such outrage here.
That's true. Yeah, I'm very worried about this phenomenon. In fact, I think if one goes back 10 years, 2011, when the Anna movement was taking place, and it was a pretty, it was a very visible movement. What worried me that year was the fact that we experienced very little in terms of the Occupy Wall Street movement phenomenon that many other countries in the world were experiencing. Or, the Arab Spring happened in the same year. I think one thing we should really think about in our own country is why people do not respond sufficiently to acts of injustice. If people are not sufficiently responding to acts of injustice, not resonating to it, that means that somewhere we have to kind of look deep down within us and ask ourselves, is there something, are we going wrong somehow? Because of which we're not sufficiently resonating to this. So this point about, the atrocities against Dalits and the fact that it is not eliciting the kind of response like the Black Lives Matter movement, I think is a matter of great concern.
And also Muslims are also being humiliated, attacked, and we don't see so much outrage.
Well, I mean, it goes back to my point that if one section of society is being humiliated and hounded and troubled, and people are not addressing it, that disease is going to spread to the rest of society. It is only a matter of time before the rest of society is also going to be afflicted by a similar disease. It's as simple as that, and which is why I took the Myanmarese example. I mean, if people at that time, back in 2017, had responded to the atrocities against the Rohingyas in Rakhine State, if people had just come out on the streets and said this is wrong, that itself is a major way of countering this. If people stay silent, then, I mean, my favorite quote quite often is Edmund Burke. I think I quote him a number of times, but I think that once he said that the reason why evil prevails in a society is not because of a lack of good people, but because good people don't speak up. I mean, the act of speaking up and just saying that a wrong is a wrong is the first step towards redressing an atrocity or a wrong. Why isn't this happening in our society? That means there's something deep down that is wrong in our moral fiber. And it's important to kind of, every one of us.
Is it to do with the division of the society on caste, religion, class, other factors?
Yes, very much so. I mean, we are a notoriously caste-ridden. Now, increasingly, the class gap is increasing. The communal division has been there. So I think it has very much to do with these divisions in society. The fact that there are ghettos in which people of only one particular kind live, that people then develop misconceptions about other people. I mean, at the end, human beings are human beings. There is not much that differentiates between a Hindu and a Muslim, and an upper caste Muslim and a lower caste Muslim and a Dalit. I mean, of course, there are class differences and all of that, but people must realize that it's important that when anyone suffers, the rest of society must actually go, stand up for it. To come back to these Brexit debates, this hatred of the immigrant, this desire to shut off British borders, is an instance of, you cannot disconnect yourself with what is happening in the world. I mean, at some point, the nastiness of the world will come and affect you. And it's important to address the nastiness before it comes and affects you adversely.
Sir, in your work, you have said that Islamophobia should be understood in context with, anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism, yeah.
And you have also said that these two phenomena cannot be understood without taking into account nation state as a factor.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And the exit of Britain from the European Union is also some kind of triumph of the idea of very strong nation state.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So you want to say something more on that?
Yes, I mean, the phenomenon of anti-Semitism that I've tried to understand, I've done it through the writings of Hannah Arendt in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And she's written very extensively on anti-Semitism in the late 19th century in Central Europe. And the way that I've tried to argue this out is that anti-Semitism arose from suspicious viewing of the Jewish population presence as not being able to be fully assimilated in nation states, as having this kind of a problematic, anomalous position between nation states. In an analysis of anti-Semitism in the late 19th and early 20th century, what becomes very clear is that it's the rubric of the nation state which allows one to understand how the fear of the Jew is arising, a fear of the Jew as not being sufficiently assimilable in the nation state, as having what I've referred in this book to as an anomalous position between nation states. Now, the point about Islamophobia is slightly different. It's it's a prejudice, or it's a form of racism like anti-Semitism, but it's a form of racism which has manifested itself much more recently compared to anti-Semitism. However, in the kind of conjoint analysis that I've tried to do in this chapter, what I have suggested is that again it is the framework and the rubric of the nation state that is important, because what that rubric gives you is this unfounded prejudice and fear and hatred of the Islamic presence and Muslims as being problematic presences within nation states rather than between nation states. I mean, that's how I'm trying to differentiate between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. In the analysis that I'm trying to put forward here, I'm looking at anti-Semitism as arising from the problematic positioning of Jews between nation states. In the case of Islamophobia, I'm arguing that the hatred and unfounded fear of Muslims is arising from a perceived problematic positioning of Muslims deep within nation states, whereby Muslims are constantly looked at as potential fifth columnists, as not being loyal enough, as being more loyal to a kind of a pan-Islamic presence. Many times these fears are unfounded. A bit of historical perspective, a bit of attempting to overcome fears will be able to eliminate this. But I think the problem is the education system that we have, whereby history is not taught properly, whereby history quite often reinforces prejudices that people grew up with, and then the media, which is playing, I think, a diabolical role in the whole situation. I think the media truly can be called evil in the way that the larger media discourse is playing out. I'm horrified by things that the media has to say. And I think that these fears are compounded by the media. And this compounding of fears, it works to the advantage of quite often populist parties like the Conservative Party in the UK. And it helps them, I know, as you said a little while ago, helps them win elections. But this comes at the great cost of the immense damage that is being done to the social fabrics of many nations across the world.
Sir, in your chapter, or chapter 6, you have talked about Islamophobia and 5 macro levels. Macro levels.
Yeah.
5 macro levels that are reinforcing, reinforcing Islamophobia. So I think these are very, very interesting and very important ideas. They have not been dealt with in great detail in the book.
Right.
And as we were just talking about few minutes ago, you said that these points can be developed into a book. So we are eagerly waiting for the book which you will be writing in the future. But right now we will just take those 5 points briefly.
Yeah.
So you have said that 5 things are supporting Islamophobia, or we could say there are 5 pillars on which the evil of Islamophobia is standing. So one is Orientalism.
Right.
The second is discrediting multiculturalism. Then the third is how Islam is accused of being against liberal democracy. And then how the global war on terrorism, that discourse has completely created conditions where Muslims are being demonized and they are being used as a punching bag.
Right.
And the fifth is that the new media, and the media which you were talking about, that they are playing very evil role. New media, mainstream media, social media, they are also spreading rumors, and they are also feeding into majoritarian prejudices.
Right.
So what I will just ask you, that please spend some time on these concepts. Orientalism, how Orientalism is supporting Islamophobia.
Well, I mean, of course, Orientalism comes from Edward Said's famous book, and in fact, one of the first books that I read as a master's student when I came to JNU, and I have fond memories of reading that book, which is a difficult book to read. I also remember that Edward Said came to JNU campus that year in December 1997, so many years ago. The point about Orientalism is that it's not a book per se about Islam. It is a book about the stereotyping of the lands of Islam.
Yes.
Okay. About
and
the Middle East.
also the land outside the colonial.
Precisely.
Yes.
I mean, it's the way that these lands were colonized by a particular knowledge of these societies. Now, I think that it's important to kind of make these distinctions very clear. strictly speaking, Said's book Orientalism is not about Islam, it's about the lands of Islam and how these lands were colonized on the basis of knowing about them.
Yes.
On the basis of the discourse that was created about these societies. Now, the discourse that has been created about Muslim societies, to go back to the media point, is a very problematic discourse. I think journalists who, not all of them of course, but many journalists who report on issues of Islam are not sufficiently educated in terms of understanding these societies. There are certain assumptions that are made in terms of reportage. So 7 or 8 years after Said wrote Orientalism, I think in the year 1985 or perhaps it was 1986, he wrote a book called Covering Islam. So I think the problem is the larger pervasive presence of the media. In fact, point 1 connects with point 5,
yes.
your last point.
Yes.
The assumptions, the preconceived notions, the preconceptions that people have when they are reporting on the lands of Islam. Now, in this larger media environment, to some extent, I look at, let's say, the presence of Al Jazeera as significant because it is an international news channel that is based in a Muslim country, Doha, Qatar, in some ways, its reportage acts as an antidote. There's a greater level of sensitivity, but
it is very little.
It's limited. How many people watch Al Jazeera? For that matter, how many people watch BBC these days or CNN these days? Most people are getting their information from these echo chambers of social media.
So Edward Said's contribution is that our reality, our history, our identity have been corrupted by the colonial knowledge. So they did not only rule us, but they also change the way we are thinking.
Absolutely.
And that durability of colonial knowledge continues, and this also contributes to the durability of, let's say, the demonized, stereotypical image of, let's say, the marginalized community.
Absolutely.
So, and now the second point is that multiculturalism by the conservative in the British society has been discredited. And the space which is being left by, let's say, some kind of evaporation of the multiculturalism is being filled in by Islamophobic discourse. So you want to elaborate?
Just a few minutes ago, I went back 10 years, to the year 2011. Let me do that again. Let me go back to 2011 and Norway. Anders Behring Breivik, this far-right figure who gunned down many youngsters. And it was a hatred of multiculturalism and Islam that he was talking about. Now, I'm not very enthused by multiculturalism. I think it's a very superficial accommodation of diverse cultures. But the point that I do want to make is that the hatred of multiculturalism amongst the far right, which is very pervasive and present in Europe.
The way secularism is being demonized.
Very similar to that in India, the way that secularism is being demonized, you have this kind of, as a parallel.
Secularism.
It's called secularism, that's right.
Secularism.
Very unfortunate, I must say. It's very, very unfortunate the way these terms are used. But you can see a very clear parallel. The demonization, the discrediting of secularism in India is akin to the demonization and discrediting of multiculturalism.
It becomes also being discredited.
Yeah, similarly, it's part of what he called the Nehruvian consensus. Secularism is part of that. But because of this influence of the far right, as you very rightly pointed out, this kind of a space that is left, this vacated by multiculturalism, large doses of Islamophobia come, to fill these spaces. So this is why these spaces are so important. This is why it's become so important to support secularism in India, or for that matter, some form of multiculturalism in Europe. Not that it's been very successful. For that matter, secularism has not been very successful in our country. There has been a certain kind of a superficiality to its presence. It hasn't been deep-seated enough to be able to prevent the onrush of forces of hatred, of communalism, of casteism, and similarly in Europe as well. Multiculturalism was perhaps not deep-seated enough. It needs to be rethought. So there were many instances of this discrediting of multiculturalism. Again, if I go back 10 years, 2011, the then British Prime Minister David Cameron, at the Munich Security Conference, talked about the failures of official multiculturalism. So the point that I really want to kind of bring up here is that all these attacks on multiculturalism, however flawed it may be, I'm not denying the flaws, but these attacks on multiculturalism, they pave the way for the rise of Islamophobia. That's the broad point that I'm trying to make in response to your question.
Okay, so Orientalism and Orientalist discourse is also supporting Islamophobia. The defeat or rejection of multiculturalism is also reinforcing Islamophobia. The third point is, and which is very much connected with what is happening in Afghanistan and several Muslim-dominated society, and it has also been an allegations by Orientalist scholars and European scholars, a group of at least, that Islam is against democracy, Islam is against liberal democracy, Islam is against, what should I say, secularism. And I know Farid Zakaria and other people, they do some kind of survey that which is proper democracy and which is not proper democracy. And I was reading also Huntington. He also keeps talking about, okay, why there is the case of success of democracy, why there is fall. And what is my impression is that when they will study non-Muslim society, these scholars will take several factors, political economy, social conflict, other issues. But when they have to study Muslim society, they will take Islam and Muslim society as if that it is not changing, it is stagnant, and religion is the only determining factor. And I think from this it flows that we keep hearing, I think in popular media, that okay, Muslims are against democracy, they want to bring Sharia regime. So these are also very, very frustrating, and it feeds multiculturalism. If you want to say something on this.
I mean, the question of Islam and its incompatibility with liberal democracy, I think the assumption shows a certain kind of inherent and very minuscule level of Islamophobia. I mean, the idea seems to be that liberal democracy is a kind of a finished product and everything must be fitted into it. I think it's a wrong question to ask. I think the question that really needs to be asked is that there are ways in which Islam and Muslim peoples and societies can contribute to what are called the background conditions of liberal democracy. And I mean, I see no reason why Muslim population presences and Islam as a religion and as understood as a larger civilizing force cannot be considered to contribute to democracy itself and the advancement of democracy. Remember, democracy is not a finished product. The very fact that liberal democracy is so endangered right now means that it will have to reinvent itself to make itself much more, much tougher than it has been so far. Just to give you an example of how prejudiced this is, let me take the example of a country like Hungary, for example, and its strongman Viktor Orban. Now, the fact that Orban talks in terms of illiberal democracy, he says this very clearly. Now, no one calls that an instance of whatever, Hungarian or Magyar, the ethnic group, the dominant group there, as an instance of Hungarian or Magyar, opposition to democracy. There are many societies in the world whose democracies are threatened by things which have nothing to do with Islam. So there is a very selective reading of democracy. And again, I think the democracy enterprise and project of the West has been very flawed. One of my favorite books on democracy that I often share and discuss with students is Timothy Mitchell's Carbon Democracy, where Mitchell clearly, kind of argues that the whole democratic enterprise is linked up with the hydrocarbon industries in the Middle East, and how when democracy was convenient, it was supplanted. When it wasn't, so
regime was changed.
I mean, Afghanistan right now, as we speak right now, those 20 years of American and British presence in that country.
Not much is being talked about, and now everything is being reduced to whether Taliban is good or whether Taliban is bad.
Well, we all know the Taliban. We don't know. Of course, we've seen the Taliban from 1996 to 2001. It was, many things were horrific. We just don't know what's going to happen right now. The reports are very concerning. And in fact, it's instances like Afghanistan which reinforce the conception in people's minds that there is something inherently wrong with Islam, that it cannot be made compatible with democracy. But I think people must question the assumptions on which they raise some of these points. That is very, very important.
And two other points which are also supporting Islamophobia is global war on terrorism and the discourse post September 9/11, and also how internet and media are playing evil role
Yeah.
in maintaining the stereotypical image of the Muslim society or the Muslims. So you want to say something?
Well, I mean, 20 years after September 11th, we will be marking, the 20 years since 9/11. I think people need to realize that the war on terror was a great mistake. That terrorism, which certainly I am not denying is a problem, cannot be countered by this form of going into Afghanistan, bringing about regime change. If terrorism is to be countered, it must be done through an international legal architecture, through the International Criminal Court, through the International Court of Justice. Now that's one aspect. I think it was a great mistake. These 20 years, these first 21 years of the 21st century, I think have been a great mistake. People must realize that that particular war on terror was misplaced.
I think you have mentioned somewhere in your book that the damage caused by counter terrorist activities is more.
It's bigger.
Yes,
it's bigger than that.
Yes,
it's bigger than that.
Is much bigger than what the so-called terrorists have.
Absolutely. I mean, the supposed solution to the problem is actually much bigger than the problem itself. Now, one aspect of this problem, which is a deep-seated misconception in many people's minds, where they equate Islam with terrorism. So, I mean, I often ask people, have you heard of the Sendero Luminoso? Have you heard of the Lord Salvation Army? Have you heard of the Tupac Amaru? Have you heard of this is a German group whose name Bader Meinhof gang? Have you heard of the Red Army? I mean, these are all terrorist organizations. Now, what the media has done is it has driven into people's minds, day in and day out, that the only terrorism that you have is Muslim terrorism. Of course, there are Muslim terrorists. I'm not denying that. But the problem of terrorism is not confined to just Muslims.
And then internet and media, how they are...
Well, I mean, the role of Facebook, for example, I'll go back to the Myanmar example, and the role of Facebook, for example, in targeted killings of the Rohingyas. I think that what social media platforms do is that they become a platform of amplifying hate against communities. And I'm not a great social media user.
And one experience I can share with you, that if there is a particular regime, and if you are critiquing, very valid criticism if you are putting, and that criticism goes against the interest of, let's say, the authority, what the social media will do, they will curb your reach. So in one way you are free, but you are not free.
Yeah, well, I mean, we all know the phenomenon of trolling. We all know that social media, in fact, if I go back to the Brexit phenomenon, one of the reasons why the vote was swung to the Leave side was because of targeted social media targeting at people's Facebook accounts. There was a big report on this, and it seems that what Facebook data from Facebook accounts was being harvested, and that data was then used to target people in terms of convincing them that.
And it is also being used during election also.
Yeah, I mean, elections, for example, the Netflix documentary, The Great Hack. I don't know if you've seen it. But that shows you how social media, the internet is manipulating elections. President Trump's victory.
And any criticism of government is also suppressed in the name of community standard.
Well, yes, of course. But, the larger point about democracy, I think, is that if there is one threat to democracy right now, it is technological developments that are arising from the social media. I think social media giants do need to be curbed. Facebook and all the various forms, and I think also the big tech companies, there must be a certain kind of a control of these, because they are clearly too big in terms of their influence. They are in many ways, I think, they're tearing societies apart. They are driving people into hating other people. Especially Facebook's role has been looked at very critically in this regard, and personally speaking, the politics of someone like Mark Zuckerberg, who of course is the head of Facebook, is something I find very distasteful. In terms of his silences and his associations, to put it like that.
Sir, last question.
Yeah.
Your critique would argue that Islamophobia and the very discourse of Islamophobia does not give a space for the internal criticism of let's say, the Muslim society. What is wrong within the Muslim society? That vices are suppressed in the name of Islamophobia. So any criticism, they would argue that any criticism, legitimate criticism of, let's say, Muslim, would be called, oh, you are Islamophobic. So how to maintain that balance, that okay, you are critical also, you should be allowed to express yourself also, and at the same time you should also respect the sentiment of the people also.
I don't want to stretch this point about respecting sentiments too far, because I think this is a very misplaced kind of an argument. But I do.
If I rephrase my questions, how to maintain that balance?
Well, I mean, again, that's a good way of putting it, and I think that it's important to recognize and acknowledge and concede that the presence of Islamophobia must not become an excuse against legitimate criticism.
So they will say that the elites among the community, the Muslims elite among the community, they are against reforms. Women are suffering. There is a caste discourse. So when we will be talking about it?
It's always a difficult question to answer this, but I mean, it can be captured in this one line. I mean, this one line that Islamophobia must not be used to ward off legitimate criticism.
Okay.
It must not. You know, a parallel would be anti-Semitism, for example. I mean, the criticism is that quite often, anti-Semitism is used to ward off legitimate criticism against Israel, for example.
So, anti-Semitism is one thing, and criticism of, let's say, Zionist state is another thing. So,
well, I mean, the most recent aggression of Israel, for example, I mean, that cannot be counted with anti-Semitism. So similarly, using that parallel,
yes.
I mean, I would want to use that parallel to suggest, well, when it comes to Islamophobia, the problematic aspects of Muslim societies cannot be defended. That would be defending the indefensible. Of course, there are critiques which are in a wrong spirit, and the spirit of the critique is not to kind of redress the problem, but rather to play up the problem. And this is where I think things become very, very difficult and problematic.
Thank you, sir. Friends, we were just talking about Islamophobia, and our guest, our speaker is Professor Amir, who teaches political science at JNU, and his book, Brexit and Liberal Democracy, Populism, Sovereignty and the Nation State is just out. It has been published by Ruthless. So what we have done, we have taken a few points and we have discussed this. I think that can never be complete, that you should read the book and you should write to Professor Amir Ali. You should give your comments, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abhay. Thank you. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, sir.